everybody. Back to our Distinguished Speaker Series. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Behrend. Dr. Behrend received her BS in Psychology from the University of Pittsburgh, her PhD from North Carolina State University in Industrial Organizational Psychology. She is currently an Associate Professor of IO Psychology at George Washington University. She does research on workplaces and virtual environments. A few areas of particular interest for Dr. Behrend are resolving barriers to computer-mediated work effectiveness, so that's especially in the areas of training, recruitment, and selection. She also does research on methodology, especially has done a lot of work on internet-based samples. Her research has been covered in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. She has more than 50 publications, mostly in academic outlets, high-profile academic places, and has an H index, for those of you who are familiar, of 18, which is really impressive. Perhaps even more impressive than that, she is currently active, NSF grant for $3.3 million working with STEM and high school students, helping them find career paths in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. She's also the co-editor for the Handbook of Workforce Readiness and the Future of Work. She was a Cyber Initiative Fellow at Stanford Center for Advanced Study. Was that last year, 2 years ago, thereabouts? Which is a big deal. Getting to work at the Stanford Center for Advanced Study is a really, really big deal. And Tara did that. She also does consulting for public and private organizations in training, selection, workforce development. She's the editor for the Industrial Organizational Psychologist, or TIP, which is, those of you who are IO psychologists, I know you all get this in your inbox, so you'll know her from there. She was a former fellow of the Massachusetts Institute for College and Career Readiness, again, helping young people figure out what they want to do with their careers. She is currently an advisor for the American Council on Education and Workforce Development Programs. That's, again, same kind of thing, helping college students and people train the future workforce. And currently, she is running for the PSYOP External Affairs Officer. So, if you have that email from PSYOP saying we need to elect officers, check that. It was about 8 or 9 days ago you'd have received that, and vote for Tara to be the External Affairs Officer. And she's also, I don't think she's going to talk about this at all today, but a big fan of poetry, particularly haikus. I'm no good at that, otherwise I would give you one, but maybe if we ask later, she'll present some for us. Thank you very much for joining us. We're super excited to have you. Please join me in welcoming Tara.
Thank you, Ron, for that amazing introduction, and thank you all for having me here. Today I'm going to talk about a series of studies having to do with the broad category of advanced technologies in recruitment and selection. So this is a really interesting time to think about technology and selection. There are all sorts of gadgets. I'm sure you get a lot of this in your business. This is an example of someone using virtual reality for a realistic job preview to learn about what is it like to work on the railroad. We've seen people using virtual reality for the purposes of selection in the context of a situational judgment test. Right? And when we look at this, do we really think that the virtual reality is adding something special to this entry-level test? I don't know. These are the kinds of questions I'm asking. Oh, please excuse me. Sure. Technology. Should I do something to it?
Just don't touch the screen.
Don't touch it. Okay. All right. This was a recent Wall Street Journal video some of you might have seen about artificial intelligence and selection. And the premise of the video was, are robots doing hiring now, right? Is that what we're looking at? And they were, they're calling it artificial intelligence. Of course, it's machine learning, but that's neither here nor there. What they're talking about is things like HireVue that analyze facial expressions. They analyze tone of voice. Right? They try to do some pattern matching to figure out some sort of secret signals about a person's hireability based on this video interview. So these are in the news every day, right? There's a lot of attention about this. The studies I want to talk to you about are trying to understand what the science behind some of these technologies might look like. The early research in this area was all about comparing face-to-face to technology. right? Asking the question, well, is this virtual thing the same as the face-to-face thing that came before it? And that's really not what the question should be anymore, right? We're not in a position of choosing between face-to-face and technology. Rather, we're going to assume technology is being used and ask the question about how to do it best. And the big questions around how to do it best have to do with how to ensure fairness and validity, right? That should be our big goal. How do we maintain positive applicant reactions? And how do we balance information gathering with privacy and respect for individuals? Right? The kinds of data we can collect are kind of infinite at this point, but how do we do so in a way that respects the people who are providing this data and measures things that are important to predicting job performance and not extraneous and not construct irrelevant? Okay, so those are some of the questions, the broad questions that I think about when I think about studying technology in the context of selection. So I'm going to go through a series of empirical studies today. I would love for you to interrupt me as much as possible to ask questions. I welcome any sort of additional detail questions I can provide. And what I'll do after going through these studies is try to talk about some general themes in a future agenda for how we can think about this problem. So there are some past theories that we can draw from when we think about technology and selection. Media richness is the oldest and most famous, right? This theory has been around since the 80s, and what it suggests is that when there are more cues available, we have better communication. A cue would be visual information or tone of voice information, that synchronicity that happens with face-to-face communication, instant feedback about whether your message has been received and understood properly. Right? The argument of this theory is that more cues is better, meaning face-to-face is the ideal, followed by video, followed by phone, followed by text, followed by email, followed by a flyer that I stick in your mailbox. Right? This is what this theory would argue. Now, this theory is fairly old at this point, and so it's worth asking whether this model still holds up. In 2008, Denise Petoskey had this great model. I know you can't read the details. It's not essential that you do. Starts with media richness components. Transparency, meaning how clear is what's happening here, how much social cues are transmitted, what's the interactivity of the medium. So these first three components of her theory are essentially media richness. And then this last one, surveillance, is the fourth. Surveillance has to do with real and perceived privacy that is inherent to a medium. Okay, so this model is attempting to build on media richness and offer this extra dimension. Now, I think that surveillance dimension is one of the most interesting ones. If we look to economics, economists have a law they like to call Goodhart's law. Goodhart's law says that when a measure becomes a target, it is no longer a good measure. That means that people are smart. They can game a system. If you tell them what's being measured, they can change their behavior accordingly, right, to meet that standard, to aim for that goal. This is essentially surveillance as an extreme form of goal setting. Right? If I tell you that your productivity is being measured by how many physical hours you spend sitting in your chair, you'll sit here all day, but it doesn't mean you're doing anything valuable. Okay, so we understand this intuitively, and yet we forget that surveillance is a cue about what's important. Now, this is my favorite example of this phenomenon. So this story may or may not be apocryphal, but I'll tell it anyway because I like it. So FedEx was trying to optimize their business, and they did so by putting GPS devices in their delivery trucks and trying to figure out, are drivers taking the optimal route? Right? Are they spending too long per stop? Are they speeding? Are they driving in a way that is wasting time? And from this information, they decided, well, drivers shouldn't really be spending more than a few minutes per stop, right? That's not necessary. And so this now became the target, right? The measure became the target, and they said, all right, drivers, I want you to make sure that you're only spending a few minutes per stop. And the drivers thought to themselves, well, we can't really control how long it takes to find parking. We can't control whether someone takes a long time coming to the door. But the thing that really takes a long time is getting in the back of the truck, rooting around, looking for the package. And that takes a ton of time. So we'll just skip that step. So the driver started pulling up to the curb, taking a sticker saying, we tried to deliver your package, and then going on their way, right? Thus optimizing the time per stop, which is what they were being held accountable for. Obviously not the intended outcome of that story, but this is what surveillance can do to people. Right? It narrows your attention so well that you forget about the big picture. Okay, so now imagine what's happening in a selection context where your attention is being focused on just a few metrics. And we don't want to have this occur. Okay. So these are the general theoretical frameworks that I'm thinking about when I think about technology and selection. Now, I first got interested in this topic in the context of virtual worlds in recruitment. So about 10 years ago, Second Life was kind of all the rage, right? And so this was the beginning of my career, and I thought, Second Life, what is this all about? So here's a picture of a Second Life recruiting fair, right? The idea is that it's more interactive, and so people should be more excited to learn about a company in this medium. Okay. Here's another picture from the American Chemical Association saying, you know, we're not a faceless company. Look, there are faces here, right? We are people. And so I really wanted to understand whether this would be a good idea. It seemed like a gimmick, but I maintain my scientific skepticism. So the question I asked in this study was, can potential applicants obtain necessary factual information about a company this way, right, to make a good decision about application? And can the medium send accurate organizational culture cues? Right? This would be important for establishing whether you're going to fit in a place. And so if not, this is a waste of energy. So I used a 2x2 experimental study. We're going to see a lot of 2x2 experimental studies today, by the way, so buckle up. And the conditions were either web information, kind of traditional web information, or a virtual world, and a culture that was either high in teams orientation or low in teams orientation. And the idea would be to see, can people pick up that difference that we're trying to convey with one of these two media? Okay? So that's what we're looking for here. And how effortful is it? How much energy does it take to extract the information that you need? Okay. So we either showed people web information like this, right? So here's some information about capital management technologies. Or we presented the same information in the context of a virtual world where an avatar would walk around and read information and speak to a recruiter that was kind of on site. All right, so what do you think we found? Well, the first thing we can look at is subjective mental workload. That means how much effort did it take, how much cognitive effort did it take to obtain the information that you needed? And what we see is that the virtual world, the high richness condition, took a lot more effort to process. There's more things happening, more things to pay attention to, and so we see higher workload. Okay, so that shouldn't be surprising. That's exactly what we found. Factual knowledge was then worse. So people learned less in the virtual world than they did in the website. And this is contrary to what media richness theory would predict, but it shouldn't be surprising, right? It's more effort. You're learning to navigate in this environment. You don't really have the extra capacity to absorb the factual information that's being conveyed. Yeah?
So do you think part of the amount of effort put in, it goes back to the question around the surveillance, that because people are in this virtual world and there's all these like things that they're going to click through, that they might be thinking, oh, they'll know if I don't stop at each poster and like read through it, versus something that's just kind of on its face?
Maybe. So the question is there maybe a surveillance component here directing people's behavior and causing them to try to put on a good show, that they've put in extra effort? I don't know. I mean, this study was done a few years ago. We weren't really thinking about the surveillance aspect of it at the time, but it's a good point. And some of the other things I'll go through today, I think, address that even better. Yeah. So factual knowledge, worse in the virtual world. Culture knowledge, now again, we were showing them either a high teams culture or a low teams culture, and it was kind of backwards, right? So people in the high richness condition thought the non-teams culture was more teamsy. So they were not able to pick up on those subtle cues. That's how we can interpret this graph, that the culture cues we were trying to portray about collaboration, about working on teams, about celebrating teamwork, people didn't pick those up. They weren't aware of what was going on. The factual information, by the way, was things like where is the company located, what are the benefits packages, right? And so neither the concrete information or the abstract information was conveyed properly. Okay. So what we learned from this study was that added richness made it more difficult to learn about a company in this case, and it was harder to discern cultural cues. But one thing that I found amusing about this study is that the people in the virtual world, despite learning much less, felt more confident that they had learned a lot. They said, oh yeah, this was great, we really learned a lot. So they're bad judges of how much was really happening. Okay, so in this case, more technology, more richness, more interaction was not better in this case. Okay. The next study I want to talk about is in the testing context. So from the beginning of internet-based testing, a concern has been cheating. Right? How do we know that the person taking the test is really the person they're supposed to be, and can we always proctor them? A solution that was proposed to this to this problem is to do remote proctoring. So in remote proctoring, you are taking a test on your computer and you hold up your ID to a webcam, to a person, to show that you are really the person that you claim to be. And then while you're taking the test, there's a person creepily watching you take the test. Right? So we're talking about surveillance. Here's somebody literally looking over your shoulder at every moment while you're taking the test, okay, to make sure that you're not cheating. They have you stand up with your laptop, turn in a circle to show there's no one in the room behind you, no one under your desk. Right? It's really quite thorough. So I was fascinated by this, and I wondered, does this really work to reduce cheating, or does it harm performance by increasing anxiety because somebody is watching you and kind of looking at everything you do? So either of these effects would cause the same outcome, which is that your score goes down. But in one case, your score goes down because you're not cheating. In other case, your score goes down because you're stressed out because someone is watching you. Okay? So I wanted to understand which of these dynamics was at play, or maybe neither of them was at play. So 2x2 study, I told you there would be a lot of these, where people were either proctored or not proctored, and then everybody took 2 tests. The first test was the Gre Practice Test, where the answers are easily Googleable, right, if you just put in the words. So if someone wants to cheat on that test, it is no problem. Okay. The second test that people took was a modified version of the Raven's progressive matrices, and we modified them so that you could not Google image search them. Okay, so there's no way to look up the answers to these questions, right, because they're all image-based. There's no phrase that you can put into Google, unless, even if you knew to search for the term Raven's progressive matrices, it is not efficient to find the answers this way. Okay, so everyone took a test, one test where it was possible to cheat, one test where it was not possible to cheat, and then half of the participants were monitored while they were taking the test. Okay? And we were looking at performance differences as well as reactions, so anxiety, dropout rate, like do we see applicant attrition, and so forth. All right. So here's some possible results, because I want to show you how to think about what we found. So we've got an unproctored test and a proctored test. We would expect that for a test where you can Google the answer, people's scores would be higher because they could cheat if they wanted to, right? But that for the unsearchable test, if it looks the same like this tells us that that difference is due to anxiety, right? So they're going down in both tests where they're proctored, and they're going up in both tests where they're unproctored. So this is an anxiety effect, okay? In contrast, a cheating effect would look like this, where their score is only going down for the unsearchable, or for the searchable test, right? Okay. So these are the 2 possible ways our results could look. One suggests anxiety, one suggests cheating is the cause of the effect. We can't measure cheating directly, which is why we're trying to come at this sneakily, right? By giving people 2 tests, one where they can cheat and one where they can't. And we're looking at the difference between those 2 scores. Okay. All right, so these are the hypothetical possible results. Here are the actual results. So the actual results suggest no anxiety effect, because if you look at the unsearchable test, the scores are the same, right, whether they're proctored or not proctored. But there is a cheating effect here, meaning the proctoring reduced cheating, okay, without harming anxiety. So this is interesting to me. I wasn't expecting it. But it tells me a lot of things. So applicant reactions, people said they felt more pressured in the proctored condition, and they had more privacy concerns. And the more people dropped out of the proctored conditions, but those feelings did not affect their performance. So they felt anxious, but their performance was not harmed as a result. Okay, I guess that's good.
Do you see any sex differences or race differences on this?
Did I see any sex or race differences? I didn't look at those, but we could absolutely do that. We have that data. That's an interesting point. Like, are some people more prone to feeling anxious? It's a great question.
Well, also, like, depending on who the person that's watching you, right? Like, so if there's, like, for me, if there's a white male watching me versus an African-American female, do I have a difference in anxiety?
That's true. So the person doing the watching is also an important factor. In this case, we controlled for that because they didn't see the person's face. So they weren't aware of who was watching them. But of course that would matter, right? And in some of my other research, I've seen pretty pronounced similarity effects, right? So people seem to kind of trust people who look more like them. Absolutely. All right, so some of the conclusions from this study. 1, people don't like being trusted, but they acclimate to it. They accept it. And I think that effect is only going up over time. In fact, in a very recent study I've tried to replicate this, and I found that people are not even fazed about being monitored in their jobs because it has just become accepted or expected, right? This is the year of GDPR and Cambridge Analytica. Like, we kind of understand that someone's always watching. So some of those effects have been kind of dampened. But this could not be a more low-stakes situation, right? This is an experimental study. Nothing will happen to them either way, and yet they took this monitoring incredibly seriously. And I know this because, well, first of all, people did cheat when they had the opportunity to, but also, unsolicited, they wrote in comments to my survey that said, listen, I was looking off screen for a few minutes, but I wasn't cheating. Like, I just got distracted because my roommate came home. Or, I'm drinking a drink in the study, but I didn't write the answers on the drink. I was just thirsty. And I didn't ask them to justify their behavior, but they were clearly very concerned about how they were coming across in this study. Okay, so I found this, fascinating that the stakes couldn't be lower, and yet the effect persisted. Okay, I've also looked at this exact dynamic in the context of online interviews. So online interviews also do have a surveillance component to it, right? Like, people are watching you. There's a video being captured, and it isn't always clear who will see that video, right? And what will be done with it. The first thing I did to understand this phenomenon was look to the literature and did a meta-analysis. Now, I don't expect you to read this. This is just a visual cue. These are all the studies that have been done to compare face-to-face and virtual interviews. And this includes things like telephone interviews, video conference interviews, and also, in one case, chat interviews, like over text message. Okay. And so in a meta-analysis of these studies, what we discovered is that applicant reactions are more negative in online interviews, not surprising. Performance ratings are also more negative, again, not surprising. And there is a moderator such that real interviews have even a bigger effect. But there was the same pattern for phone and video, so this is not a richness effect. Right? If it was a richness effect, we'd expect there to be some difference between these two very different media. And then I thought, well, maybe it's a novelty effect. Right? Maybe it's just a strange thing to participate, and if it were a novelty effect, it should go away over time as people become more accustomed to video interviews. So I plotted all the effect sizes chronologically. It's not a novelty effect, right? And if anything, it's getting worse. Okay, so it wasn't a novelty effect, and I thought, well, what else is going on? What else about virtual interviews is so unappealing to people? Is it a sign of disrespect to interview someone online that says you can't even be bothered to show up in person? Is it something else? I don't know. One thing that I thought about was, this is a reasonable scenario of what it looks like to be interviewed online. Here's you, and then, oh, look, you're basically looking in a mirror the whole time, right? There is somebody, there's a picture of yourself kind of staring at you the whole time. So surely, while you're trying to give a good interview answer, you're also, oh dear, my hair, and like, I'm making a weird face, I should stop making that face, right? It's a source of distraction. There's a person here, a stimulus here that is not here in a face-to-face interview. So let's try to understand this. So 2x2 external design. And I either kept that picture-in-picture image present, or I took it away. And then I changed the context of the interview. I told people that either they were being interviewed for potential selection to a research assistant position, or they were helping me in a study by evaluating the performance of the interviewer, and then they were giving me feedback about how well the interviewer did in conducting this. So the stress was either high or low. Right? These self-awareness dynamics that happen should be higher when the evaluation context is higher. Okay. So then I'm looking for self-awareness, again, workload, performance, and reactions. All right, so what do you think happened? So picture-in-picture on the x-axis here, the blue is in the evaluative context and the red is in the non-evaluative context. So self-awareness was highest in the picture-in-picture context, although these are pretty small effects, right? So these are not anything to have a party about. Cognitive load, also highest. So what this graph says is that little picture of yourself looking at you in the face when you're trying to do an interview is a source of distraction. It is taking away some of your attention from what you're supposed to be doing, which is giving an interview, and it's directing it to you and thinking about whether you look right and whether you're making a weird face, and trying to match up your eye contact so that you're looking in the video camera. Okay. Again, just like in the past few studies though, no major effect on reactions and no major effect on performance. Okay, so there's something happening here, but it's not a big enough thing to really panic about. Any questions? Yeah.
Did all of your participants have the same level of comfort with using technology?
Good question. Did all the participants have the same level of comfort with technology? We did measure that and controlled for it and also explored it as a moderator, and it didn't end up mattering very much. So there wasn't a wide range of experience because we were dealing with young people who are mostly pretty fluent with technology. The age and experience question is a really interesting one. In a study I've got going on right now, we're looking at attributions of errors based on age. And so ask me in 6 months what I think about that. Yeah.
Were all the students motivated to get a research position to really ensure that it's a stress barrier?
Yeah, probably not. So were they all motivated to do well? Probably not, and yet we still see this effect on workload. And the proctoring study also showed me that even when the stakes are very, very low, there's enough of a pressure by just saying you're being evaluated. Even if the stakes don't matter to you, by me framing it as you are being evaluated, that's enough to add it.
How did you measure performance in cognitive load?
Sure. So how did I measure performance and cognitive load? So performance was measured by a human rater who graded them on 7 competencies, and we had 2 raters check for agreement. And then cognitive load is a self-report measure.
So when they were interviewing somebody else, there was a specific rating form for that too?
Sure. So they were never the interviewer. Even when they were in the low evaluation context, the context was go pretend to be a candidate and then tell us what you think of how the interviewer did. Like, are they professional? Did they do a good job? But they were still the interviewee. Yeah.
I was just wondering, in any of your studies, do you look at socioeconomics as well? That, like, living in different, like, from poverty and other places, there would be different motivation, different, like, people have achieved one, like, where they can come from achieving and not, depending on where their socioeconomics.
Right. So sure, have I looked at socioeconomic differences, which would, I imagine, affect a wide range of outcomes, and especially the stakes that are associated with performing well, right? I haven't in any of the studies that I'm talking about so far. There is one study in here where I am considering that kind of issue. But, you know, I consider these kind of minimal test cases, right? Like the stakes could not be lower, and we still see these differences, right? So you're right that in a high stakes context, I would expect most of these to be exaggerated quite a bit. Great question. Other questions? Okay. All right. Now the other thing that I alluded to at the very beginning of my comments was this video recorded interview as a phenomenon. So the way this works is that you as a candidate are asked to record yourself answering questions, right? You interview yourself, send it in, let us know how it went. And so you submit these questions to a web service like HireVue or another provider, and a human rater would grade them later, or maybe an AI grades them later. And my student, this is Sam Kaminsky's dissertation, was curious about whether this would be like a different experience than having a synchronous in-person interview. Okay, and so we looked at this together. The first thing to note is that, yes, it is a different experience psychologically. So at the beginning of my comments, I went over briefly Petoskey's 4-level assessment typology, right? And transparency, social bandwidth, surveillance, and interactivity. So the first thing that Sam did was check to see if these 2 media differed on those 4 dimensions, right? Does a synchronous interview feel different in terms of surveillance than a video recorded interview? And in all cases, yes. So video recorded interviews are lower in transparency, lower in social bandwidth, higher in surveillance, and lower in interactivity. And so then the question next is what happens as a result? You're asking someone to submit to this different kind of experience. Okay. So what he found is that, this is actually very surprising to me, he found that people who took place in the video recorded interview had lower cognitive load. They engaged in fewer impression management behaviors, right? Things like mirroring the interviewer's language. I suppose that makes sense because there's less opportunity to do so. They had better perceptions of procedural justice. They thought this was a more fair experience, and they had equal overall reactions. We also looked at the measurement invariance to see if synchronous interviews and asynchronous interviews measure different constructs, right? Such as interpersonal skills, right? Maybe they're measured differently. And in fact, they were measurement invariant, meaning the same constructs are measured in both cases, and people liked or felt that this was more fair in the video recorded context. Now, I can offer you some speculation about why this is, right? If you are participating in a video recorded interview and you mess up, you can erase it and do it over again, right? And there's no chance of kind of these similarity effects popping up if the interviewer is just some text on a screen, right? So people might feel like this is a better opportunity to put their best foot forward. On the other hand, it does seem to suggest or convey a lack of respect, in my opinion. It says, you are not important enough to waste a recruiter's time on, so please interview yourself, right, and send us the video. Okay. So overall, what I think these studies show us is that technology can either remove bias or introduce bias. An early study on online interviews from Strauss showed that attractive candidates had a relatively stronger unfair advantage in a face-to-face interview over a telephone interview, right? So of course they did. But in this case, the technology is removing this irrelevant bias. On the other hand, technology can introduce new biases. So in a study I ran a few years ago, I found that when I replaced a person's image with a cartoon avatar in an interview, the attractive avatars had an unfair advantage, right? Like, everyone knew that this avatar had nothing to do with the person interviewing, and yet they still got a higher rating. Okay, so we can remove biases, we can also introduce new ones, and we need to be really careful about that. Okay. Overall, the technology story is one of unintended consequences. I mentioned before, and I'll say it again, that measuring something sends a very strong message about what's important. Right? If you're measuring it, people will change their behavior accordingly. In the proctoring study, I said don't cheat, and people went to all kinds of crazy lengths to convey to me that they were not cheating, right? But that doesn't mean they were doing other things that I cared about. And again, comparing non-tech and tech doesn't really make sense, right? There are all sorts of subtle differences within media that end up having pretty profound effects. What we're working on now in my lab is a typology of these assessment characteristics that is psychological in nature. And then the last thing I want to talk about on this topic is that individual differences turn out to be really important when we think about how people react to technology. So I'm sure that's no surprise in this room, right? The individual differences matter. Just a few quick examples of how it matters. So here's a survey that the Pew Research Center did. And they said, imagine that your office is getting new office surveillance cameras in order to catch thieves, and we're going to keep this footage on record. How do you feel about this? So who would find this acceptable? Just raise your hand. Nobody, really? A few people? You're shy? Okay. And then who would find it completely unacceptable? Interesting. So when the Pew Research study did this survey, they found that about half of the people said it was acceptable, and then a quarter of people said it wasn't, and a quarter of people said it depended. Right? And so there's these kind of individual reactions to being monitored that we know matter. Here's an example of how it matters. So this is a study I ran recently about how surveillance can cause people to withhold effort as a kind of reactance measure. Right? If I'm restricting your autonomy in some way, then you kind of say, you can't restrict my autonomy, I'll show you, and you withhold discretionary effort. And in this case, I looked at people who had either high complexity or low complexity jobs, right? And the people who had high complexity jobs who were monitored a lot withheld the most effort, because in their minds, you can't control me. I have a fancy job. How dare you, right? And so that was the dynamic there. So this is job differences and reactions. In terms of individual differences, we've looked at goal orientation as a potential moderator of effects. In this case, this is evaluation apprehension as an outcome, and people who are highest in avoid performance goal orientation reacted the most negatively when being monitored. In this case, it also depended on the kind of monitoring, whether it was done synchronously or archivally, meaning nobody's watching you on a screen, but we're taping everything and storing it in a box for later, right? That was the most intimidating scenario for people who are high in avoided performance goal orientation. I've also looked at reactance as a potential personality moderator of some of these effects and found that, yeah, there is generally not an overall effect to some of these kinds of technologies. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is kind of moving beyond assessment to thinking about other contexts where technology matters a lot. And so this is a picture of a virtual reality welding machine that I'm using in a study right now. So somebody who is learning to be a welder, like the Tulsa Welding School, right, would put on this virtual reality helmet. That's what you're looking at here. That looks just like a welding helmet. And they're going to do some virtual reality welding to develop their skills. And what's really great about this kind of technology, well, there are a lot of things, I could go on and on about it, but look at this feedback that you get while you're learning. So it's tracking everything you're doing while you're in this context, and it's giving you real-time feedback about the angle and the trajectory that you're welding at, and whether, so there's 4 variables. There's how fast you go this way, there's your angle up and down, there's your angle back and forth, and then there's the distance from the welding plate. And you're getting real-time feedback on all 4 of those variables so that you can learn better, right? At a higher level, they're tracking how often per week you practice in the booth, and whether you practice early in the morning or late at night, and which skills you seem to struggle with, right? Are you struggling with a particular kind of skill the most? This feedback can be viewed as very invasive, or this data collection can be viewed as very invasive, or it can be viewed as really helpful in improving your skill set, okay? So when you frame surveillance or monitoring, there are these 2 frames. One frame is we're watching you to make sure you do what you're supposed to do, right? To check up on you. And the other frame is we're collecting information to give you personalized feedback and help you improve your skills. But in these 2 cases, the same information is being collected, and the only difference is the framing, okay? So one of these frames is Big Brother, and then the other frame is Microsoft Clippy, right? Who's just trying to help you. I love Clippy. I wrote my dissertation about Clippy, that's true. All right, so same dynamic, totally different effects. In a study I worked on this topic, we were trying to figure out if these frames affected learning, because it could be a distraction, right? Again, you could be trying to optimize your behavior towards what's being tracked instead of what's best for your learning. It could be a cue for what you should focus on. It could induce a performance orientation instead of a learning orientation, where you're afraid to make mistakes because you're so concerned that those mistakes will be tracked. Right? So any of these things could potentially happen. What we found in our experimental study is that the framing did not affect declarative knowledge acquisition, but it did affect skills acquisition by a full point on a 1 to 5 scale. And it also dramatically affected how much people spent in practice and remedial activities. And so considering these small decisions makes a big difference when we think about all the inputs to an advanced analytics context in learning, right? That the kinds of things we measure send a message to people about what they should be doing with their time. Okay. So for future work on this topic, I'm going to be looking at whether virtual reality can support learning in a skilled trades context. And does this virtual reality kind of high data environment change the way people think about their jobs, and does it support ultimate skills transfer? Okay. These are some hot off the presses pilot results from yesterday. But so far what I'm seeing is that the high technology virtual reality scenario can improve people's self-efficacy, their perceptions of person-job fit, and their interest in pursuing a welding career. So the 4 bars here, the blue is reading some information about the career of welding. Pink is watching a video of some people doing some welding. Orange is participating in the virtual reality that I showed you. And then gray is like a low fidelity virtual reality that's more like a hands-on demonstration. And this virtual reality, this immersive virtual reality, does actually improve people's interest in pursuing this career and their efficacy. So again, this is a pilot that is based on just a few, like about 100 people, but we're hoping to scale this up in the coming months. So in conclusion, assessment media shouldn't be thought of as a single entity. We can really introduce or remove construct irrelevant variants. The most important thing I want you to leave with is that tools don't have inherent properties. A shovel and a spoon both work, but they work for really different purposes, right? So we shouldn't be asking, does a technology work? We should be asking, what is it useful and not useful for? And I think that's the way to move forward with some of these new innovations. So I'll stop with an acknowledgement to my fabulous team who is largely responsible for this work, and I look forward to your questions. Yes?
I don't think you were looking at this specifically, or at least from what you presented, but maybe you were getting there tangentially with the stakes at which some of these manipulations are taking place. But I'm wondering if there is a difference between me seeking out a job or some type of advancement versus just general development. because this last scenario you're presenting, it seems like it's pretty, like, the only thing I have to benefit is me getting better at welding, but it's not a high stakes of if I don't do well in this AI scenario or virtual reality scenario that I may not get a job. Have you looked at that in any more detail, specifically on job versus trying to obtain a job?
Sure. So I think what your question is getting at is the inherent stakes of the context and whether those contexts are more learning oriented or performance oriented, right? So, So yeah, so if you're trying to get a job, you are in a performance orientation. It's not a time to be making mistakes and learning and getting better. But if you've got a job and you're trying to advance, the stakes are different. I wouldn't say they're lower, they're different. If you are in medical school training to become a surgeon, the stakes are quite high for you mastering that skill by the end of the period with which you have to learn something, right? But you are more likely to be in a performance orientation, learning orientation in that kind of context. So, so far I've been looking at how monitoring can induce a particular goal orientation, but I think you're right that these situations also do have inherent stakes with them, and looking at the interaction would be really valuable.
Could you go back to the slide with the hot off the presses results?
Yeah.
So, like with either interest or efficacy, or just in general, so the fourth category, you said, was that hands-on as in they were the ones doing it in real life, or they were watching someone else?
They were doing it in real life. So the orange category is like a full virtual reality like you saw. The gray category is you're holding a plastic welding gun and you're running it along a metal plate, and then you're looking at a screen that looks as if you're in a real welding scenario. So it's like a low fidelity virtual reality, if that makes sense. Okay. Now, to note, I'm currently running 2 more conditions for this pilot. One of the major advantages in this virtual reality scenario is not when you're in the helmet, but when you're watching someone else in the helmet. There's this really amazing social learning dynamic that happens where you get excited, you're watching someone do something and you think, like, I can do that better, and when it's my turn, here's what I'm gonna do differently. And you're able to learn by watching other people. That's impossible when you're watching a real welder, because there's a spark and it's very difficult to see what's happening and there's hot metal flying everywhere. But it's very easy to do in VR, and you can rewind it, move it at a different angle. So the social learning component is the one that we're looking at next. Like, does watching someone else in virtual reality achieve the same effects as participating yourself? Because the classrooms that have these in there, all the students get so excited, and only one person can use the VR at a time, but all the other students crowd around and they get excited. It's like watching someone play a video game.
Is that the kind of work that you're doing in terms of the STEM research?
Right. So part of the reason I'm interested in welding is that you learn a lot of math and science when you learn to become a welder. There's angles, and there's chemistry, and there's gas compositions, and there's understanding the composition of different metals. And even if you don't become a welder at the end of it, you know a lot of math and science, and you can take that with you elsewhere. The other cool thing is that girls specifically who are afraid to get into an actual welding booth will try the VR and get really good at it. And then they're ready for the welding booth. And then they start thinking of themselves as, hey, if I can do welding, I could do carpentry, I could do plumbing, I could be an engineer. The world of possibilities becomes much bigger for what their options are. So that's part of the reason that I'm very excited about this. Any other questions?
This is great human factors research. That's really very cool. I love it.
Yeah, NC State, where I went to graduate school, has a very strong human factors program, and I think I've absorbed a little bit of it kind of through osmosis in the way that I think about experimental design. Great. Well, thank you again for your attention. I hope it was helpful.